The first step is to download your pattern. Select your file according to your paper format and the size you wish to make. Print your pattern at 100% scale. There is a scale test included on the first page of your pattern to ensure you have printed correctly. Trim around the thin black border and use clear sticky tape to piece the pages together. There is a layout included in the instruction guide to help you lay out all the pages correctly. If you need more help with this, we have a comprehensive instruction video on how to print and assemble your pattern. I'll leave the link below. Trim around each individual pattern piece and lay the pattern onto the fabric. You can follow the cutting layout included in the instructions to make the most economical use of your fabric. Cut according to the individual instructions marked on each of the pieces. For this style, there is an optional tulle petticoat. If you don't wish to use it, just omit these steps. Open out the centre front bodice gathers piece so the right side is facing towards you. Using the longest stitch length on the sewing machine, stitch along the long vertical outer edge of the pattern piece. Don't back tack on either end and keep a long tail of thread at either end. Pull on the threads to gather down each side of the piece. You want to gather the edge to be small enough so that the piece matches the centre front bodice piece. Once the piece is gathered small enough, tie off the threads to secure the gathers in place and ensure all the gathers are evenly distributed. Next, place the centre front bodice gathers on top of the centre front bodice piece. Both of the right sides of the fabric should be facing up towards you. Pin the two pieces together and stitch all around the outer edge of the two pieces to hold the two layers in place. You've just done what we call basting the two layers together. Now you'll repeat all of these basting steps for the remaining bodice pieces. Take care for all other pieces to ensure that you're making a pair of each, meaning the two side bodice pieces, for example, will mirror image one another when finished. Once all of the bodice pieces have been gathered and stitched together, open out the centre front bodice piece so that the right side is facing towards you. Place the side front bodice piece on top of the centre front bodice piece along the seam, matching up the adjoining notches. The right sides should be touching one another. Pin these pieces in place. Stitch these two pieces together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then repeat for the other side, so both of the side front bodice pieces are attached to the centre front bodice piece. Next, place a side back bodice piece on top of the centre back bodice piece, matching the adjoining notches. Pin in place. Stitch the two pieces together using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other side so that you have a pair of back pieces. Place the back piece on top of the front piece, matching up along the side seams. The right sides once again should be touching one another. Pin in place. Stitch along each of the side seams using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you've done this, all of the front bodice pieces will be together on the main. Next, we'll work on the straps. The straps are optional for this style, so if you don't want to use them and just have a strapless dress, just omit these steps. Fold the strap piece in half with the right sides touching one another. Sandwich your piece of cord or cotton tape in between the strap at the folded edge. Stitching along the outer edge of the strap, starting at the blunt edge and continuing all the way down the long edge, using a 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance when you sew. Leave the pointed or angled edge unstitched as we will be turning the strap through this opening. Pull on the cord to turn the strap inside out. Once this is done, cut the cord as close as possible to the seam allowance and give the strap a good press with the iron. This is why it's best to do it with a cord as close as possible to your main fabric. Repeat this step for the other strap. Note that you can reuse the same piece of cord over and over for both straps, as long as you ensure it is long enough. Position the straps onto the garment. Place the raw angled edge onto the front neckline, aligning with the side front piece at the seam. The angled edge will cause the strap to angle inwards towards the centre front. The straps will actually crisscross at the centre front over the top of one another. Machine stitch over the strap at the neckline edge to hold it in place. Set aside the main bodice for now while we work on the lining. For the bodice lining pieces, repeat the steps for stitching all the bodice pieces together, matching up all of the pieces with their adjoining notches and stitching using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once your lining is together, turn your lining over so that you are looking at the wrong side. Place a piece of rigoline or sew-in boning on top of the seam allowance. I'm using a 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch flexible boning. You can pin the boning piece in place and ensure it finishes 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch above and below the edge of the seam. Use a sewing machine to stitch the boning onto the seam allowance, and then repeat this for all of the bodice lining seams, including the side seams. Place the lining piece on top of the main bodice piece with the right sides touching one another. Pin along the top edge and stitch along the top edge using a 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Clip into the top edge of the bodice and turn it through to the right side. Give the top edge bodice a really sharp press with the iron. Set aside the bodice pieces for now while we work on the skirt. Open out the front skirt piece with the right side facing towards you. Place each of the back skirt pieces on top of the front skirt piece with the right sides touching one another. Pin in place along the side seam. Stitch each side seam using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Overlock each of these seams. I actually forgot to film this step, but make sure your skirt side seams are overlocked. Stitch along the top edge of the skirt using the longest stitch length on the sewing machine. Don't back tack on either end and leave a long tail of thread at both ends. Pull on the threads to gather down the top edge of the skirt so that it is small enough to fit on the lower edge of the bodice. Once it is gathered down to the correct size, tie off each of the ends to secure the gathers in place. Use your fingers to ensure the gathers are evenly distributed. The side seams of the skirt will match up with the side seams of the bodice. Place the skirt piece together with the bodice at the lower hip edge. The right sides should be touching one another. Pin only the main outer shell of the bodice to the skirt. Leave the lining layer of the bodice free for now. Stitch along the lower hip edge using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, we're up to the tulle steps for the skirt. If you don't want to add the tulle in, that's alright, just omit these steps. However, it does give your skirt a nice bouncy shape. Repeat the same process of stitching the side seams of the skirt together for the side seams of the tulle. Once that is done, you can also go ahead and gather along the top edge of the tulle as well, just like we did for the main piece of the skirt. We will also add the lining into the main garment, stitching along the hip seam, just like we did for the main piece of the skirt as well. Press the lower edge of the bodice lining under by 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch with your iron. Pin the lower edge of the bodice lining down along the seam. All the raw seam allowances should be pressed upwards so that they get hidden behind the bodice lining. Next, we'll use a hand sewing needle to secure the bodice lining together with the main garment along the lower hip seam. Once the lining is neatly secured in place, you can overlock the centre back edges on each side separately. It's time to install the zipper. Open out your invisible zipper and pin each side of the zipper tape to the centre back edge. Stitch each side of the zipper tape down using the invisible zipper foot on your sewing machine. Note that a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance has been given to install the zipper. Next, pin the seam below the base of the zipper closed. The right sides of the garment should be touching one another. Stitch from the stitching at the base of the zipper all the way through to the hem edge using a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now we'll turn down the top edge of the zipper tape and tuck it underneath the centre back seam allowance. Use a hand sewing needle to secure the zipper tape in place along the top edge. Now it's time to finish up with your hem. Turn the main hem under by 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch. Press this well with the iron. Then repeat this step, turning the hem under by another 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch, and press well with the iron to enclose all of the raw edges. Once that's done, you can top stitch the hem in place. All done!